A new threat has emerged on the battlefields of Ukraine. Crows carrying landmines. Seriously, I'm going to have to lead with that. It'd be irresponsible not to, but there are a few other things worth talking about today. Ukrainian President Zelensky had a phone call with Chinese President Xi. We've got updates from the Battle of Bakhmut. The Taliban killed the Islamic State leader responsible for the Kabul airport bombing. And Donbass Devushka, the U.S. Navy veteran with quite the online presence, gave an interview to Russia Today. But first, this video is brought to you by Delta Team Tactical and NorthTac, who have teamed up to provide high-quality, battle-tested products for all your firearm needs. From assault optics to red dot sights and magnification combos, NorthTac is a great solution to add precision to any setup. Click the link in the description below to learn more and get 10% off your purchase. All right, starting out with this crow deal. So this popped up on Twitter a few days ago, and I haven't been able to find the original source, but it turns out this concept is actually possible. So starting with these little pedal mines, these are anti-personnel mines, PFM-1s. They're scattered over a large area either by artillery or dropped in bombs from aircraft. They're nasty little things. It's not that big of a blast, enough to maim an adult, but more than enough to kill a child if they come across one. And there's no off switch to disarm these, so even removing them once they're found can be pretty risky business, and it takes very little pressure to set them off. There is a bit of variance between these, but I've had folks tell me that with the pressure between your thumb and forefinger, that would be enough to detonate one of these types of mines. That always leads to the question of, if that much pressure can set one of these off, how do they not go off when they fall from the sky? It's a timed fuse, so they don't actually activate until a period of time after they've been deployed. So that hard drop to the ground doesn't set them off, but a few minutes or hours later, they're primed and ready to go. Lastly, because this is always a hot topic when we talk about these nasty little PFM-1s, these have been used by both sides in this conflict. This is a legacy Soviet munition that both Ukraine and Russia had quite a few of in their arsenal before this war kicked off. Okay, so these little PFM-1 anti-personnel mines only weigh 2.8 ounces, which is pretty light, and crows can carry upwards of 8 ounces. So it's very much light enough for a crow to pick one up and carry it away, which immediately makes me think back to the pressure needed to set these off. If this does it, gotta think that a crow squeezing a little too hard during flight would be more than enough. So if you come across crows dropping mines over battlefields, or more importantly, random small explosions in the air, send those videos and pictures over. The world needs to know and understand this new threat. All right, on to the big phone call. On Wednesday, April 26th, Ukrainian President Zelensky had a little chat with Chinese President Xi. It is big news, the two speaking for the first time, I think, ever, but at least since the war kicked off. But I wouldn't get too awful excited about anything major coming out of this, at least not yet. China has kind of presented themselves as a neutral party in this conflict, which, take that as you will. On the one hand, they've maintained very close ties with Russia, and the trade between the two nations has increased since the war began. But on the other hand, China hasn't stepped forward to provide any sort of lethal aid or military equipment that could be used by Russia on the battlefield. At least as of March 25th, that's still the view of the United States, with President Biden saying, quote, "I've been hearing for the past 3 months that China is going to provide significant weapons to Russia. They haven't yet. Doesn't mean they won't, but they haven't yet," end quote. If you remember a few months back when there were rumors about China sending weapons to Russia, it was top of the agenda for diplomats all around the world, making a point, anytime they could, to say that China shouldn't do it. I bring that up to say that if there was even just a little bit of evidence that China was providing lethal aid to Russia, I don't think we'd be trying to cover that up. So when you compare the current Chinese set with much of the European Union and the United States, it does sort of paint China in at least more of a neutral status than we are. I mean, I don't think anyone could consider the United States a neutral party at this point. There's just too many of our weapon systems floating around the battlefields of Ukraine to really make that claim. That puts any sort of peace process in an interesting situation. Who's going to broker that deal? I mean, as of now, it doesn't look like Ukraine and Russia are on the verge of sitting down together, but realistically, this conflict is going to end in some sort of negotiated settlement. That's just how the vast majority of wars end. And someone is going to have to serve as a relatively neutral party to broker that deal whenever it happens. And China is positioning to do just that. Now, China did release their own peace plan back in February of 2023 that was pretty vague in a lot of areas and just sort of rattled off some high-minded ideas that don't necessarily mirror events on the ground. For instance, there was no real mention of what would happen to any of the Russian-occupied territories. Do they stay Russian? Do they go back to Ukraine? Is there some solution in the middle? That's a pretty big part to any ending of this war. So to leave out that sort of substance leaves the document more as a political statement more than any sort of realistic path to end the war. I do think it's of note that Zelensky has been interested in meeting and keeping communications open with China. And from his perspective, I think it's a smart move. Overall, the U.S. has been kind of wishy-washy on this. I mean, it's telling, though. If Zelensky thought the most likely path to victory was with exclusive deals with the U.S. and NATO, maybe he wouldn't have taken that meeting. It could mean that the U.S. needs to rethink how we're approaching certain aspects of this conflict and what we would need to do if we want to be a major player in how this all ends. Sticking with the war in Ukraine for a moment, as has been the case for a few months now, the heaviest fighting is happening in and around Bakhmut. We'll pull up a few maps here. This view from the Deep State map is the current situation in Bakhmut as of 28 April 2023, but it's messy. I mean, this is an area where the fighting is house to house, room to room, and any progress is most accurately measured in meters. I know a lot of folks have their preferred mapping tool, and when you zoom into the city here, you'll see a few differences between them. So for reference, here's a map from the Institute for the Study of War compared with a map from Rybar. It looks like the major differences are really on the north side of the city. It's just, we're talking about meters here, so no two maps are going to be exactly the same. Whichever one you think is the most accurate, which in reality is probably a little pull from each one of them, the bottom line is that the situation in Bakhmut for Ukraine is looking tough. A few weeks back, Russian forces, primarily the Wagner Group, shifted from an attempt to encircle the city to attacking head-on from the east. And Russian progress there has been pretty slow now for a little bit. Slow and likely at a heavy cost to both sides, but steady. Here's a look at Russian progress over the last 3 months. This is what it looked like over the last 2 months, and this last one here shows Russian gains in Bakhmut over the last 30 days. I think it's safe to say that as of today, Ukraine occupies around 10% of the city of Bakhmut. And even more critical of an issue, their supply lines to the west appear to again be under direct fire control by Russian forces. I've seen some analysis over the last few days that Ukrainian forces are setting the stage to withdraw from Bakhmut, so you may see the entire city under Russian control before too long here. So it'll be interesting to see, whenever this battle reaches its conclusion, if Russian forces move to exploit that shift in the lines or settle into more of a defensive posture in preparation for the anticipated Ukrainian offensive. All right, moving outside of Ukraine real quick, we've got an item here that brings up all sorts of mixed emotions. If you remember back during the Afghanistan evacuation in 2021, there was a suicide bombing outside the Kabul airport on August 26th that killed 182 people, including 13 U.S. service members. As you can imagine, images coming out from that day were horrific. So many innocent lives lost as they gathered to try to leave the country just as the Taliban were taken over. The attack was pretty quickly claimed by the Islamic State Khorasan province, which is the Islamic State offshoot that operates in the northeastern provinces of Afghanistan. The U.S. quickly responded with a drone strike on the 27th, claiming to have killed 3 ISKP operatives who were behind the attack. 2 days later, the U.S. conducted another drone strike against supposed Islamic State operatives. However, investigations later found that rather than the terrorists involved in the attack at the airport, this strike killed 10 innocent civilians, including 7 children. Fast forward to April 26th, and reports are now coming out that the Taliban killed the mastermind of the Kabul airport attack during operations in southern Afghanistan. Now, the name of the individual hasn't come out yet, and U.S. officials said the operation actually took place in early April, and the news is just coming out now because they were waiting to confirm that the Taliban got the right guy. Now, there's no evidence that the U.S. was working with the Taliban or that this guy was even specifically targeted versus just killed in the ongoing war that's really heating up in a lot of ways between the Taliban and the Islamic State. Lastly, we've got the Donbass Devushka. Now, this story really blew up a couple weeks ago, but I think it's worth keeping an eye on. There's so much here. There's no way I'm going to be able to dive into all the random little tidbits, but overall, a U.S. Navy veteran created an online persona pretending to be a Russian supporter from the Donbass area of Ukraine. Hence the name. Over the last year or so, she's picked up a pretty serious following on Twitter and Telegram and has been hosting a geopolitics-focused podcast on YouTube for a few months now. I actually thought her YouTube interviews went back further than this. Maybe it's just a new series or new uploads, or I'm just mistaken. But anyways, these are the ones that are publicly available now. Then on April 16th, a story broke. I first came across it on Malcontent News, saying the Donbass Devushka was not exactly who she said she was. There's folks who've done deep dives into all the things she said or posted in the last year, and it's all over the place. I'm not sure where this is all going to land. I'm not a lawyer, and I think this is actually going to be a little bit complicated, which is why I was pretty surprised that she just gave an interview to Russia Today. The reason I was surprised by this is that it still seems very much up in the air if she's going to be investigated for any sort of crimes. It's not illegal in the United States to be pro-Russia or to voice support for what they're doing in Ukraine. But when money starts changing hands, things get very complicated very quickly. again, not a lawyer, and I've only watched this play out at the surface level, but if she were to have fundraised for the Russian military or a Russian military group or been paid by a Russian organization, it's entirely possible that some sort of crime was committed. Now, from what I've read and come across in this saga, this recent Newsweek headline isn't totally accurate. I really haven't seen any evidence that she was working for Russia, which to me at least makes it sound like she's getting paid directly for her efforts by the Russian government. But the fact that this whole thing is still playing out made me think that if she does have a lawyer, which I would imagine she does at this point, I can't imagine they want her giving too many interviews, and certainly not with Russia Today. I mean, it seems like one of the last places you would want to give an interview if you were at risk of being investigated for potential ties with Russia. Just one man's opinion, but I am sure we're going to hear more about this one in the future. But that's all I got for now. We'll see y'all next time.